That the fossil record seems to establish deep time and change over time. The other point is that the fossil record is not chaotic, it is ordered, and it is ordered taxonomically. If you go up the geological column from deep to upwards and from older to younger, you find overall a pattern from getting from less complex to more complex, from less similar to modern flora and fauna to more similar. You have this kind of transitional fossils which seem to be intermediate in anatomy, and sometimes you can even arrange them in transitional series like the horse series. Darwin mentioned 6 times in his book Origin of Species, natura non facit saltus, nature doesn't make jumps, because he knew saltations would require some kind of miraculous interventions. And saltations are the thing that the fossil record really documents, are the things that happened in the history.
The Tiktaalik, they say, lived 370 million years ago. It was a fish-like amphibian. It did not have digits, so it's inaccurate to call it a tetrapod.
Next, there are supposed evolutionary fish, like Tiktaalik, typically shown in textbooks as a 375-million-year-old fossil that was on its way to progressing into a land-dwelling creature. Sometimes the coelacanth is also shown in this same lineup, living about the same time frame. Now, however, both of these have been ejected out of the evolutionary lineup. Evolutionists used to think that Tiktaalik's strong front fins did most of the work to pull this transitional fish up onto land, leaving the hind legs to evolve later. But now, after more investigation of the pelvis and fins, the discoverers of Tiktaalik have developed updated illustrations showing how it used its strong pelvic structure for paddling. Even more amazing is the fact that scientists announced in the 2010 Nature journal that they had found footprints of a 4-legged land creature in Poland that are supposedly 10 million years older than Tiktaalik. So, if Tiktaalik was the ancestor of land creatures, how could land creature fossils sit 10 million years earlier in the rock layers than their ancestor? There goes Tiktaalik as a clear transitional fossil, yet it's still found in school textbooks today.
This creature, they say, is the ancestor to birds. Had a light feather covering as opposed to a bird with a complete feather covering. And you also have the Archaeopteryx, which is a similar primitive bird covered with feathers but could not fly, it could only glide.
The 2 leading transitional fossils that are used in school textbooks today are falling apart. The Archaeopteryx supposedly shows the transition between dinosaurs and birds, but now leading experts regard it as just a bird. Paleontologists have tried to turn Archaeopteryx into an earthbound feathered dinosaur, but it's not. It is a bird, a perching bird, and no amount of paleobabble is going to change that. Archaeopteryx was further disqualified as an evolutionary ancestor for birds when scientists found a crow-sized bird and extinct 4-winged birds in rock layers designated to be below those containing Archaeopteryx.
Highly touted evolutionist experts in whale evolution. He said, in time and in its morphology, Pachycetus is perfectly intermediate, a missing link between earlier land mammals and later full-fledged whales. Well, he made that claim and had this picture drawn on the basis of what we see there on the right. Notice only the stippled segments of the skull is what was actually found. a couple of pieces of skull and a piece of lower jaw. And from that, they leaped to the conclusion that it was perfectly intermediate between a whale and a land mammal. All the postcranial bones indicate that pachycetids were land mammals and indicate that the animals were runners, with only their feet touching the ground. The first whales were fully terrestrial and were even efficient runners. Quote from Dr. Phil Gingrich, again, this whale evolution expert, and he was interviewed by a creationist for a book and for a video series. And he said, and I quote, "Since then, we have found the forelimbs, the hands, and the front arms of Rhodocetus. And we understand that it doesn't, that is, does not, have the kind of arms that can be spread out like flippers are on a whale."
Despite the bright promise that paleontology, the study of fossils, provides a means of seeing evolution, it has presented some nasty difficulties for evolutionists, the most notorious or famous of which is the presence of gaps in the fossil record. Then he says, evolution requires intermediate forms between species, and the study of fossils does not provide them. But whatever ideas authorities may have on the subject, the lungfishes, that's your great-great-granddaddy according to evolution, like every other major group of fishes that I know, have their origins firmly based in, what's that word? Nothing. The extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the what? Trade secret. It's the trade secret of paleontology. One other quote. Berlinski recently said, "There are gaps in the fossil graveyard, places where there should be intermediate forms, but where there is nothing whatsoever instead. No paleontologist writing in English, French, or German denies that this is so. It is simply a fact. Darwin's theory and the fossil record are in..."
The California Academy of Sciences claiming they came from creatures that look like hyenas. The Tokyo Institute of Science saying they came from a hippo-like creature. The University of Michigan claiming whales came from something that looked like a cat. The Carnegie Museum saying something like a wolf. A deer at the Melbourne Museum, and something like a lion at the American Museum of Natural History. Does it sound like some guesswork is at play here? In fact, over the years, evolutionists have proposed 4 different mammal orders as the possible starting place for whales. Filters, going from a tubular tail to a wide fluke for propulsion by means of a ball vertebra, so it can move up and down instead of side to side, along with a new package of muscles and new chevron bones to connect them to, going from front legs for running to flippers for steering, and losing the back legs altogether, moving the nasal passages from the tip of the snout to the top of the head, intaking fresh water to salt water, and changed kidneys to handle it, insulation from fur to blubber, external to internal ears capable of hearing mates 500 miles away.
Just think of all the parameters that would have to be modified, and then multiply that by, I don't know, 1,000-fold or more than that. That's the scale of the problem that you're dealing with.
But you know what? Those mutations, they're accidents in the genetic material. They just happen. So you're essentially relying on luck. And odds are you're going to miss the target.
In this picture, you see a lot of spots on that first horse, then fewer spots, all of a sudden no spots. What do you know about spots from a fossil record? All you have is a pile of bones, right? And there's a lot of things wrong with the horse theory series here. How do you go from a browsing tooth on your left to a grazing tooth, leaving no transitions whatsoever in the rock layer? They have found now the bones of present-day horse in rock layers below his supposed ancestors. Folks, you can't be your own grandmother. Now, that little tiny horse that was on the left, called Eohippus, its correct scientific name is Hyracotherium, and it's related to the Hyraxes today. Can you imagine putting a saddle on that creature?
Quick reference: problems with horse evolution. 1. The chart was made up by Othniel C. Marsh in 1874 from fossils scattered across the world, not from the same location. 2. Modern horses are found in layers with and lower than ancient horses. Kruzhilin, U. and V. of Shirov, a horse from the dinosaur epoch. Moskovskaya Pravda, Moscow Truth, Trends. A. James Melnick, February 5, 1984. 3. The ancient horse Hyracotherium is not a horse but is just like the hyrax still alive in Turkey and Madagascar today. 4. Ribs, toes, and teeth are different. 5. South American fossils go from one-toed to three-toed. 6. Horses are never found in the order presented. An example is Eohippus is an extinct genus of small equid ungulates. The only species is E. angustidens, which was long considered a species of Hyracotherium. Its remains have been identified in North America and date to the early Eocene Ipresian stage.
Anybody that studies horses will tell you there's a large variety of horses alive right now. And the horse and the zebra and the mule can all be interbred. Other examples, including the much repeated gradual evolution of the modern horse, has not held up under close examination. What are they saying here? In other words, it's not true. All right? 1950, G.G. Simpson, George Gaylord Simpson, who was a strong believer and a proponent of evolution, he wrote an article in Scientific Monthly, 1950, October, that said many examples commonly cited, such as the evolution of the horse family or of saber-toothed tigers, can be readily shown to have been unintentionally falsified. In other words, it's not true. It was falsified. It's been proven to be incorrect. So here's the problems with the horse evolution. This would be a good quiz question. How do we know this is, or what's the problems with this teaching? It was made up by Othniel Marsh in 1874 from fossils scattered all over the world. A Russian scientist found modern horses in layers lower than the so-called ancient horse. So if modern horses are already on the scene before the ancient horse is around, how can this be the ancestor of this? The hyrax, little rock badger, I believe, that's still running around today in the country of Turkey and in East Africa. Down in South America, when they find the fossils, the three-toed horses are on top, the one-toed horses are on the bottom. Absolutely reverse order.
I attended a conference in 2016 at the prestigious Royal Society of London, which was called New Trends in Evolutionary Biology. And there the keynote speaker was a famous Austrian evolutionary biologist called Professor Gerd Müller. And Professor Gerd Müller, in his keynote talk, alluded to some explanatory deficits of Darwin's theory. And among these deficits, what the theory cannot explain, he mentioned not only phenotypic novelty and phenotypic complexity, which is very important, of course, but he also mentioned the non-gradual forms of transition which we find in the fossil record. So this is important to see that this is already known in the mainstream of evolutionary biology. And so in my view, I think that Darwin's theory can certainly explain phenomena that we have different species of finch on the Galapagos Island with slightly different shapes of beaks of the finches, but it cannot explain how we got birds and their feathers in the first place.
Down at the bottom of this column, you have the Cambrian, and the layer above that, and the layer above that. Those first three layers on the bottom are the marine insects that suddenly appear in the fossil record with no precursors, as well as the fish above that, which are the next two layers. The layer above that is the sudden appearance of insects, and then the sudden appearance of reptiles, large reptiles, small mammals, large mammals. The transitions that they find are always within these different groups. So if you look at the first three layers on the bottom, they'll find less primitive marine insects on the bottom and more advanced or more complete marine insects on the top. And they'll say that they lived at different time periods because they're evolving. The marine insects were evolving from partial marine insects to marine insects in their complete form.
We have a sudden appearance of the first macrofossils in the Avalon explosion, that is the appearance of the strange Ediacaran biota. We have the famous Cambrian explosion, where all the different body plans, the phyla of bilaterian animals appear, again without precursors in the previous layers of the Ediacaran, with one or two exceptions. We have the great Ordovician biodiversification event, which has been called life's second Big Bang. In the Devonian next age, about 400 billion years ago, the Devonian Nectar Revolution, and correlated with this the sudden appearance of tooth-like structures in the Odontode explosion. All these names are not made by creationists or intelligent design proponents, but by mainstream evolutionary paleontologists, and it's called explosions or revolutions for a reason, because it's sudden events and not gradual events. In my own group of expertise, insects, they appear all suddenly in the Carboniferous, and not only primitive forms like mayflies and dragonflies, but already insects with a complete metamorphosis, which is very striking and very surprising. So we already have beetles in the Carboniferous. We have the sudden jump from 0 to 15 families of marine reptiles. The same pattern in gliding and flying reptiles within just 2 million years. You have these different body plans. The dinosaurs appear suddenly. There has been recently a paper in Nature Communication, and a quote from this paper is amazing how clear-cut the change from no dinosaurs to all dinosaurs was. Same pattern in mosasaurs, these marine reptiles. And in flowering plants, that is something, the sudden appearance of flowering plants in the Cretaceous about 120 million years ago was called by Darwin an abominable mystery, because it contradicted his gradualistic these bursts of new body plans that I have shown in my talk, that they always follow one of the 5 or also some of the minor mass extinction event, like the end Ordovician mass extinction, or the Devonian Kälbwasser event, or the end Cretaceous mass extinction. Some of them do, of course, where you have these kind of alignments, that you have this emergence of modern birds not too long after the end of the Cretaceous. But many of the other events do not align, or not sufficiently close to those events that you could postulate some kind of causal mechanism.
Here's a fossil octopus and a jellyfish. Now, they must have been buried quickly to preserve the soft tissue before it rotted. Yes, this is exactly what's expected in a global flood.
As explained by Michael Ort's briefly exposed diluvial sediments hypothesis, there were places that were submerged, covered by sediment, and then they re-emerged for a time. This explains how dinosaur tracks, eggs, and bones were deposited on freshly exposed flat flood sediments, as we see in the fossil.
The water coming up from under the crust of the earth is bringing with it just unimaginable amounts of sediment, with all of the water coming down from the tops of the mountains. When it covers a large area of animals that are trying to escape the floodwaters carrying all of that dirt, they get trapped in one area, and that's how they're preserved. The reason there are gaps is because the fossils are only in the locations where there was a lot of them huddled together. That's why they're called fossil graveyards. If the best way that you get a fossil is to bury it quickly with mud and water, okay, and then overlay it with tons of sediment so that the heat and pressure of the overlaying sediment bearing down with all of its weight on those layers of sediment that contain the fossil will better preserve them, turning them into stone. Petrification, we have all of it deposited at once in one area, creating the extinction events, which is actually just 5 different waves, okay, of mud and rock that buried certain localities of creatures. It buried various ecosystems. The major extinctions are not the gaps in between fossils in the geologic column. The major extinctions are the fossil. In the flood model, the fossil record represents different environments or different ecosystems full of different creatures that lived at the same time but were buried in the order of the flood's destruction. The water is covering the earth both from the bottom, where the oceans are rising, and the top, where the waters are falling from the sky, from all the thick clouds. And this order of burial of mud and rock flowing from the top of the mountains and coming up from the ocean is progressively burying the creatures. And so as they're trying to flee into huddled areas for warmth and for protection and for dry ground, these localities, clusters, get suddenly buried. The first 40 days and 40 nights of rain covers all of the pre-flood mountains, and then the modern mountains are formed after 150 days of the water continually increasing even higher than the mountains that existed before the flood. And after 150 days, all the water that's been depleted from under the crust of the earth leaves a vacancy, which then collapses. The mid-oceanic ridge, the mantle under the crust, rises first in the Atlantic, pulling on the Pacific side of the earth, causing it to collapse. And then the mountains are formed by the mantle basically pushing all of the crust together, like pushing a rug up against a wall, or folding it like an accordion, because the mantle coming up from both sides of the earth and one side of the earth being collapsed, with all the tectonic plates moving towards each other, they're clashing, collapsing, crushing, buckling, and folding.
Just as quickly as the water came up, it goes down, leaving behind a muddy mess of debris and dangers like sharp objects. Hazardous waste, also a big concern.
The process even explains the rapid and catastrophic formation of the Rocky Mountains. This happened just thousands of years ago during Noah's flood, when the fountains of the Great Deep were broken apart and the year-long process of the worldwide flood unfolded. Massive oceanic rifting on a worldwide scale created new seafloor that was pulled under the continents, creating cycles of tsunamis that occur when the seafloor binds and then releases, just like tsunamis are generated today. This explains the multiple layers these creatures are found in, as they were buried by the ever-increasing flood waters and tsunamis. These dinosaurs were buried furiously, with over 90% of them now found disarticulated or torn apart. Many of them are even found choking on mud as they died, with their necks arched backwards. Widespread volcanism that occurred during this process also shows this happened quickly, over a year, and not millions of years. With no volcanoes in the Morrison Formation itself, where the bulk of these dead dinosaurs are found, logic demands that the huge volume of volcanic ash in the Morrison Formation to have been erupted from megavolcanoes on the west coast, lofted and carried far to the east by wind. The Morrison Formation's brushy basin member alone spans 5 states and includes over 4,000 cubic miles of volcanic material. That's enough to cover the state of New Jersey in ash 740 meters deep, and there are plain indicators that this happened rapidly, not over millions of years. How else can we explain this recently discovered massive dinosaur graveyard where 10,000 adult Maiasaura were found buried in mud without a single young mixed in with the entire herd that was buried? Every single dinosaur in the area was at least 9 feet long. It sounds like the adult dinosaurs were stampeding away from the imminent danger of raging floodwaters. Their young could not keep up and became engulfed in some lower part of the peninsula.
they place the Archaeopteryx, the primitive bird, in the late Jurassic. And notice it says in between 150 to 148 million years. And so they can't get an absolute age on this. They have to have a relative age. This is an ancestor to birds that they say could fly, and it would be placed in the early Cretaceous. Again, you have the primitive bird in the late Jurassic, and the complete bird in the early Cretaceous. But the only way that you can know for sure that one of the birds lived at a different time than the other one is to select the date. You can't get the date based on the laboratory results, because the laboratory results will range anywhere from 230 to 250. 230 they will ascribe to the primitive bird, and to the complete, fully formed bird, they will ascribe the 250 million year age. But both of them are going to range. Cannot get an absolute age using radiometric dating techniques. The only thing that the technique can do is determine the level of radioactivity in the element. This creature is essentially supposed to be a reptile evolving into a mammal, so going from something that has scales to something that doesn't have scales, have live births, and other things like that. The Sinognathus, 260 million years ago, another ancestor to mammals coming from the reptile families, says it lived in the middle Triassic. This animal is supposed to be from the same time period. Another one here, Rognathus, 200 million years ago. So about 60 million years prior to those animals that were just listed. This was in the lower Jurassic. Now you have a large reptile that's supposed to be evolving into a mammal, and these are found in the upper Triassic and lower Jurassic. Below the dinosaurs, sort of, is these large reptiles that have mammal characteristics and features. The problem is that the black line in between the Paleogene, where the mammals are, and the Cretaceous, where the dinosaurs are, is where there's supposed to be all these transitional fossils. Okay, these animals that are in between both body types, in between a reptile and a mammal body type. You don't find anything in between major body types. This, they say, was an ancestor to tetrapods, and it's a fish. It's an Osteolepsis, an extinct genus of lobe-finned fish from the Devonian period, and this would be the early Devonian period. The late Devonian period would be where you have tetrapods. These tetrapods, like the Acanthostega, has 4 limbs with digits attached to those limbs, where the Tiktaalik, which is an early Devonian, has 4 fins and no digits attached to them. What's missing is the creature between Tiktaalik and Acanthostega, and the huge gap where there is nothing in between these fishes. All of them are technically fishes, and the reptiles which live on the land exclusively. This creature is placed in the early Permian, and they say it's an ancestor to frogs and salamanders. This creature, they say, is an early frog ancestor that did not hop, and this is placed in the early Triassic, and the Triassic is a layer of geologic strata right above the Permian. They say that it's an extinct genus of frog-like amphibian. The earliest frog associated with hopping is thought to be from late Triassic. So the non-hopping frog is from the early Triassic, and the hopping frog is from the late Triassic. let's go back to the chart. In the Devonian, in the early Devonian, you have these fish that are fully fish, they have 4 fins. In the late Devonian, you have fish that have limbs with digits, so maybe they were buried at the same time. Okay, and that's how they got preserved as fossils. The early Devonian fish live in the deep waters, and the late Devonian fish live in the shallow waters where they can contact the ocean floor. Okay, because they can walk around on it with the digits, but they're still fish. They still have gills. They still have to live in the water. And then you have the Carboniferous, which is where all the insects are, and nothing in between the fish and the insects to show that the insects evolved. Then you have the non-hopping frogs in the early Permian, with fully functional hopping frogs in the late Triassic. So maybe they're just different kind of frogs. It's not that they wasn't living at the same time, it's that they were living at the same time, and they were buried in different localities, because one kind of frog, which doesn't hop, lives closer to the water where it can swim, and the other kind of frog, which does hop, lives closer inland where it can just hop around and find food on the ground. What's missing from the fossil record is the creatures that are evolving from insects into fully functional reptiles. This amphibious-like reptile is supposed to have lived in the late Carboniferous period. This is another amphibious reptile that they say lived at the same time in the late Carboniferous. This creature, they say, is the ancestor to snakes, and it had legs. It is dated to the late Cretaceous period, but during the same time, the late Cretaceous, you have the earliest snake fossil with no legs. You're finding the ancestor to snakes with no legs in the exact same layer of strata as its ancestor that did have legs. But in between the hopping frogs and lizards of the Permian and the walking snakes of the Cretaceous, you have these massive dinosaurs that weigh several tons, and none of their ancestors are embedded in the rocks in between the Triassic and the Permian. They say this is the ancestor to modern turtles that had half a shell, and it lived during the late Triassic. But the oldest known turtle with a complete shell is in the same layer of strata in the late Triassic. If you take a sample of the strata from early Triassic where the half-shelled turtles are, okay, you send that to a laboratory, you take a sample of Earth from the strata which contains the complete shelled turtles, send that to a laboratory, and hypothetically you get results of 250 million to 200 million years old for both of those samples. Now you have to select, the date for the early turtle, and you have to select a date for the late turtle. And the only way to do that is just to assume that one existed before the other, because the laboratory results are going to range from 200 million years to 250 million years. You're not going to get an absolute date because of the fact that it's always going to range. This is why it's often, said about most of the fossils, 100 to 200 million years or 120 to 130 million years. They don't know the absolute age of these things. They can only have a relative age for these, and that's just based on their assumption that one existed before the other. But the truth is they existed at the same time, and the radiometric dating readings are simply a reflection of how deep you are in the strata, or how close to the surface that you are. It does not tell you the age. This Proterosaurus is supposed to be the prototype for dinosaurs. It's a reptile with dinosaur features, and they have placed it in the late Permian. Another primitive reptile, which they say is an ancestor to the massive dinosaur, is this creature. And then you have the Euroraptor that they say lived in the late Triassic. The problem here is that you have the primitive reptiles, which are found in the Permian and the Triassic, and you have the primitive dinosaur reptiles, which are smaller dinosaurs, in the exact same layers of strata. So the massive dinosaurs are still left without any ancestors, because there's no evolution from small to very massive. There's just very massive and very small. Now, if you want to radiometrically date one of the more primitive, smaller dinosaurs in the Permian and Triassic, and you want to date a massive dinosaur in the Jurassic, you can't get that date just based on the laboratory results, because those laboratory results range too much, meaning you're only getting a relative age of around 250 million years, and you have to decide if the primitive dinosaur lived at an earlier time than the more massive advanced dinosaur. But the truth is, they lived at the exact same time, and the radiometric readings are detecting a deep layer of strata where there is a higher level of radiation, as opposed to the upper layers of strata, which are going to contain low levels of radiation.
But the fossil record tells a story about sudden, abrupt changes, about saltations. And this evidence, this conflicting evidence that does not support Darwin's theory, can no longer be explained away as an artifact of undersampling or as caused by the incompleteness of the fossil record.